Hello and welcome to Theology Unleashed. Today I'm doing a discussion with Nimai. He followed the discussion I had with Tom Jump on Tom Jump's YouTube channel and wanted to carry on the discussion and add his points of view to the debate about free will. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, Nimai?
Well, I am a lifelong, I guess you would call it a theologian, that's been studying especially Eastern philosophy within the context of what would be called within those traditions the Sanatana Dharma. So that usually includes what is the umbrella term Hinduism, the Buddhist philosophies, along with Jain philosophies. And I grew up in the Hare Krishna movement. My father was a disciple of Bhaktivedanta Swami. And then at around about the age of 25, I started to explore the Eastern philosophies in a more broad, less sectarian manner. And the combination of that with some of my own personal experiences involved in meditation and yoga really propelled me into studying those conceptions more deeply, even more deeply than I had previously. And that's a little bit about me.
Cool. So let's launch into the discussion then. So me and Tom Jump were debating free will. It's not a debate I've had often because most people seem to accept that free will is self-evident and don't bother arguing against it. So I was a little bit unprepared for that discussion.
It was my favorite part of the discussion because it's very interesting and somewhat counterintuitive. And if you were just to go straight to Bhagavad Gita, the 13th and 14th chapter deal with this very succinctly. And Krishna has a very unique way of discussing the subject matter with Arjuna. And it fits pretty much entirely into the context of that conversation from more or less beginning to end, when at the very beginning he was talking about various, you could say, impositions on free will, including, most fundamentally your brain. And so I couldn't help but recollect this chapter, and I thought if we could explore it a little bit together, that it would be an interesting study. And you might find that there is a common ground that is worth exploring. Oftentimes, my criticism to Eastern theologians who debate atheists in a traditional sense, so the atheists that are anti-God, or the new atheists who are sort of not necessarily anti-God, they're kind of agnostic, but don't see any reason to accept a personal Godhead. The tendency is to fall into the trap of playing or debating on their terms of what they define or are used to defining the interactions of God and man. And the perspective of the Eastern philosophy is very different than the Western philosophy, because the Eastern philosophies are non-dualistic versus the Abrahamic religions, which are purely dualistic, and has a very different interplay in the significances and the functions of a lot of the subject matter, especially free will and determinism. So we're going to just jump straight in. I have my little Bhagavad Gita here.
It's going to get technical.
And we're just gonna explore the concept, and we're gonna see how, because he asked you about your worldview in particular and how your worldview interacts with the world in this way. And so I thought, well, what better way to do that than to be kind of direct and quite literal. But also I want to acknowledge that the uniqueness of the Eastern philosophies is it relies a lot on experiential wisdom not a lot, like in the sense that a lot of it is experienced and experienced through time by individuals who then will see what's being described here. And in my own experience, I had one of those, which gives me great faith in what's being said. So the title of the 13th chapter is called Nature, the Enjoyer, and Consciousness. Now, I'm reading from the Bhaktivedanta Swami. What edition is this? This is probably the 82 version. But I would recommend to anybody who's really studying Bhagavad Gita to have a couple of translations, because the Sanskrit is there's so much held in the Sanskrit, and it gets lost in translation. Sometimes one translator is going to pick up one nuance and another translator picks up another nuance. My brother has an edition of the Bhagavad Gita that's my absolute favorite, but I can't recall the author or the person who put it together. It's very simple. There's no purports, but the way the Sanskrit is dealt with and the amount of options for the person to try to deduce how the meaning was arrived at is fantastic. So anyway, so here, the 13th chapter starts. Arjuna said, "Oh, my dear Krishna, I wish to know about Prakriti, nature, Purusha, the enjoyer, or the perceiver, is the most direct way that we could deal with this Purusha. And the field and the knower of the field and of knowledge and of the object of knowledge." Now, the really interesting thing about this question that's put forth by Arjuna is that in each case is the polarity that he's asking, it all have to do with this Prakriti and Purusha. We have Prakriti and Purusha, he's being direct. The field is Prakriti and the knower of the field is Purusha, and the knowledge is the knower of the field, and the object of knowledge is Prakriti. Excuse me. Yes. So Prakriti literally means you could say material. We also talk about material nature, but it would be more like material phenomenology, the actual universe from Big Bang onwards, everything that's happening within what you could call what in theology would be called the mundane world, or the material world, or the world of matter, and the physics involved in all of that. That would be called Prakriti, or nature. And here Arjuna is making a distinction between the experience and the experiencer. So he's also acknowledging that Prakriti is the experience of the experiencer. The experiencer is experiencing experience, the world. Right? The Supreme Personality of Godhead, Sri Krishna says, "This body, O son of Kunti, is called the field. The one who knows this body is called the knower of the field." So the body is Prakriti. The knower of the body, the knower within this body is called the one who knows the body is called the knower of the field. The first part of the question. Then he says, "O sign of Bharta, you should understand that I am also the knower in all bodies." Now he's touched on a non-dual conception. So he's explaining that the underlying consciousness is both singular in terms of in individuals and singular on a whole. He's talking about a totality and the individual portions of being, of existence. So sometimes we use the term soul, and it gets used so much that it loses its meaning. And that would be one of my critiques to you, would be to pick these words that are very loaded and that have a lot of, they have a lot behind them. So a few words that you've used that I would abandon if I were you and find a different way of explaining would be soul, degraded, or uplifted. Those three words you used in your conversation with Tom Long, and every time I heard them, I thought, ooh, that would be Tom Jump, excuse me. They would be words I wouldn't use. So the soul, because we have everyone gets somewhat bogged down in the semantics of what you call the essential being. In Veda speak, they will call it Atma, which means the I. But there's something even more fundamental. Even if you go further into Agama, it gets more nuanced. And then we get into the realm of Buddhism when they start going, okay, they call it the spotless, that being, that fundamental being, the spotless mind, the chitta. It's not the manas, it's the chitta, the spotless mind. They say, oh, there's no soul, there's no Atma, there's no thing. This Atma is the spotless mind. So we're getting bogged down on
That's
semantics.
They don't accept the soul the way we accept it.
Yeah, but they do. They just don't call it Atma. And we come to more or less the same position as the Buddhism does if you actually go deeper into Agama and you study Shunya more. We come to the same place. No. Well, yes and no. It's going a little deeper than that even. So the what's being discussed, like there's a really interesting discussion between Coleman Hughes and Annika Harris on Coleman Hughes's YouTube channel. And if you haven't seen it, I recommend you watch this conversation. And Annika Harris presents the idea that consciousness is fundamental to reality, and that consciousness is not the cognitive processes, but being. It's being, right? And this is the same terminology that gets used in Veda when we say that the soul is fundamentally sat, being, existence, chit, a perceiver, and ananda, he's having a experience. And that this is the fundamental basis of reality. Everything is arising from this perception. Now, Krishna is discussing this in relation to Purusha and Prakriti. We're here in the world, and he brings it to the level of the body, which is also incredibly interesting. He doesn't to go out and start talking highfalutin in the world, or he talks directly. He's bringing the most relevant. He makes it extremely relevant, and he brings it into the field of the body. Then, so here he's acknowledged that the knower, there's the knower and the body, and that he is also the knower in all bodies. This consciousness is pervading everything. The description of reality within Vedic and Upanishadic speak is that of a singularity. It is one being in which the whole fractal explosion takes place of self-replicating infinity within itself. That all parts of the singularity are the singularity. The singularity is all the parts, and yet he's the whole. And because of the nature of being, he's also, or it's also something even more than that, like a fourth state, right? Krishna is acknowledging this here. He does this very interesting thing where he makes it personal to the individual, impersonal, and cosmic, then personal to himself, and then blends all the three together. So then Krishna says, now please hear my brief description of this field of activity and how it is constituted, what its changes are, whence it's produced, who that knower of the field of activities is, and what his influences are. Now this influence is the word that's used is prabhava. So one of the meanings you could say is the power. What is the actual agency that this knower has? What is his agency? Because here we're having the talk of free will and our interaction with the world. To what degree is their agency and to what degree is there not? He's addressing this. That knowledge of the field of activities and the knower of the activities is described by various sages in various Vedic writings. It is especially presented in Vedanta Sutra with all reasonings as to cause and effect. The five great elements, so we're talking Akash, so space, how does it go, the order? So we go space, wind, air, I'm doing that again, space, air, fire, water, earth. Now, when we use these terms, these bhutas, the Pancha Mahabhuta, they are the manifestations of, they are the way that consciousness is then interacting with matter. When we talk about these five elements, we're not actually talking about fire, water, air, so far from the grossest level. That's actually all on the platform of earth, really. But these are permutations of consciousness that will have they'll have knock-on effects on how the consciousness interacts with the world. But that's a whole nother discussion. No, this doesn't even matter at this point. Not really. False ego, or the conception of I that is projected by the being onto the world. In that 5 elements, going back a track, matter would be included, but it's not included in the way that you would necessarily think. Intelligence, the unmanifested, the 10 senses in the mind, the 5 sense objects, desire, hatred, happiness, distress, the aggregate, the life symptoms, and the convictions, all these are considered, in summary, to be the field of activities and its interactions. So this is nature. This is the interaction of consciousness and nature, and it's actually at the most fundamental, it's a appearance that's self-manifest from as part of self nature, of the nature of being. But these he's describing as prakriti here in this context. Then he says, humility, pridelessness, nonviolence, tolerance, simplicity. Now, we're going to back up just a second here, because this actually, we'll keep going, then we'll discuss it. So humility, pridelessness, nonviolence, tolerance, simplicity, approaching a bona fide master, cleanliness, steadiness, self-control, renunciation of the objects of sense gratification, absence of false ego, the perception of evil of birth and death and old age and disease, detachment, freedom from entanglement with children, wife, home, and the rest, even-mindedness amid pleasant and unpleasant activities, events, constant unalloyed devotion to the supreme totality, aspiring to live in a solitary place, detachment from the general mass of people. And this detachment is not indifference, it should be noted. Detachment is that you are not overly attached. It's that you can sit in an equipoise, you can sit in a position of I don't need anything from anybody, so I don't have to deal with you in such a way that's in some way self-motivated. I'm detached. Every interaction is fundamentally pure because there's nothing I need from you. And so none of my interactions are colored by some kind of motivated desire. The acceptance and importance of self-realization and philosophical search for the absolute truth. All these I declare to be knowledge. And besides this, whatever there may be, is ignorance. Now that's a big statement, but we can... I shall now explain the knowable, knowing which you will taste the eternal. Now he's alluding to the distinction, that there's a distinction between the matter and that there's something else. Brahman, or the great expanse, the conscious expanse. It's that's the best way to say it, the conscious expanse. The spirit, beginningless and subordinate. The word he's using is matparam, of me. And that I am the totality of.
That sounds like dualism.
Lies. Nope. There's a yes and no, because what's going to happen is at the highest stages, there's a recognition of a totality, that all the things within the totality are part of the totality, and yet there is also subjective portions. At the viewing point. So like if we were to discuss me and you and we would say, okay, we're one being. Well, that's also kind of self-evident. Within the context of existence, we're in one existence. There's one total existence and we're part of that existence. At the same time, we could equally say that my experience and your experience are not the same experience. There's a subjective difference. We could argue about, so the great theologian like Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, ultimately, he, and the teacher of, so Chaitanya Mahaprabhu comes to this conclusion. In the Kashmiri Shaiva tradition, Abhinav Gupta comes to this conclusion. Within the Buddhist tradition, Nagarjuna comes to this conclusion of oneness, the sameness, and difference simultaneously by dint of the way the experience actually takes place and the quantities of consciousness involved. So my perception of the totality of being is very small. Your perception of the totality is very small. Yet we're part of that totality of being. And yet that totality of being can say that all the portions are subordinate to him. Now, everywhere are his hands and legs. So now he's starting to talk about Sarvatma. So we have these two words. We have Sarvatma and Paramatma, and sometimes they're used interchangeably to mean the same thing, but there's a nuance to them. Sarvatma is the totality of consciousness taken as a field, you can say, and it includes the jivas distinctly and all of them. So the individual parts of the conscious expanse. This is Sarvatma. It's a total consciousness.
That's not just the super soul or Krishna.
You're gonna yes, but there's a slight distinction between Sarvatma and Paramatma. Sarvatma, conceptually, we're still just talking about Brahman. We haven't moved into Para-Brahman. Right. So Shiva, and specifically Sadashiva, is Sarvatma. And you're going to see that used in Bhagavatam to describe Shiva often. And he's the sum total aggregate of all jivas. They're coming through him. And that's why he's also sometimes called Paramatma. But he also has a self, the self of his self. The self of the Sarvatma is Paramatma. Slightly different. There's a nuance to it. So the Sarvatma is the original source of all. So everywhere are his hands and legs, his eyes, heads, and faces, and his ears are everywhere. In this way, the Sarvatma exists pervading everything. Now, this is a reference to the fact that all the eyes and legs and heads and faces are all expressions of Sarvatma. That the consciousness pervading all beings is Sarvatma, experiencing itself in a limited sense as conditioned souls. And that there's also an awareness that supersedes that is not limited in the same way, and that these two phenomena are happening simultaneously.
So are you talking about a conglomeration of Jivatapa?
Well, the conglomeration of Jivatapa is Sarvatma. It's the conglomeration of Brahman. It's not just Jivatapa. Jivatapa is included in that, but it's the conglomeration of Brahman.
And for the audience, Jiva is the...
would be what would be called a separated self. So it's a self perceiving itself to be an individual separate from the whole.
But
now, some people would say, keep going. What's your question?
Referred to as soul. Many theologies and
being.
philosophies have
so it's an individual. Yeah, I agree. So it's my opinion, the best word to describe a soul is a being.
Right.
It has being.
Well, you got to differentiate it from God.
Well, you don't differentiate that from God, and that's the point.
Jiva
that's the difference.
Is different from Vishnu Tattva.
No, it's not. Not at the most fundamental. Jivatapa, so when you're talking about the Jivatapa, then we can be very distinct that, it's the smallest portions of you take the smallest portions of consciousness who are acting as if they're independent. Because they're so small, they hold a very small portion of the view of reality, and therefore they easily identify with matter, which is what we're about to be discussing. Because they can identify with matter, they have a different kind of experience. That's Jivatapa. But at the most fundamental, the absolute platform is it's all Krishna. It is all Vishnu. It is all one tattva.
So what?
The truth that holds all other truths, that truth is holding Jivatapa within it. And there is no distinction between the Jiva soul, as you might call, and the Paramatma, the Sarvatma. There's actually, the distinction is an experiential one and a quantitative one. But there's actually not there's not one thing and then another thing. There isn't.
This is what Prabhupada described with his analogy to the ocean, that we're one in quality but different in quantity.
That's it. So the Upanishads give two analogies to describe the nature of the soul, and they give a description of the experiential nature being. So one is a description from the perspective of light, and it's describing the illuminating factor of consciousness, that consciousness as a perceiver is like an illuminator. And so the example is like the sun is casting light through the universe, Jiva is like a mote of that light, but really the sun is the sun, the globe, and all the light. That's one description. Then the second description is describing the experience of being. It's given a liquid description, and even if you ever experience any kind of elevated states of consciousness, the experience is very liquid. It's a very liquid feeling. It's the fact that the consciousness can feel, and so then it's like a drop of the water of the ocean, and the drop is in the once it's there's the ocean. You can take the drop. The ocean has exactly all the same. It's the same stuff as the ocean. And you could even distinguish it. You could say, oh, that drop is always that drop, even in that total ocean. You can make that claim. And yet it's not different from the ocean. And actually the ocean is the source of that drop. That there's no difference. So in the same way, this is how consciousness is discussed in the Upanishads.
Right.
And this is what Krishna is trying to make a point of. And for a good reason.
The word jiva, that I think the common colloquial term for that would be soul. And although
yes,
many traditions have odd understandings about soul, it's just our conception of the soul. And you seem to think it's not a good word to use just because there's so many misunderstandings of the word or different meanings. People.
Well, also it gives a. Yeah, I think that the best word to describe what is actually going on is being.
But why would the word soul be no good? Because in theory, that's what the word should mean. It's just a matter of how you conceive of.
Well, the thing is that the word soul doesn't describe anything. It has a definition, and the definition is a conscious being. So the word Atma describes what it does.
Well, I'm saying that the soul would be the English counterpart to the word Atma. It's just like,
but I don't think it does. So being is the actual, in my opinion, if you actually see the definition of Atma, it's describing being. Well, it's describing consciously being.
Soul, which we're faulting, which we're saying doesn't suit our use here.
Well, what I'm saying is that why not just go to the way that soul is defined and have it more, you're like skipping there's so many, there's connotations of the soul being a thing. And the thing about the soul is it's not a thing.
So
it's something.
Dictionary definition: the spiritual or immaterial part of a being or animal regarded as immortal. That'll be a different meaning.
Yeah. It's a thing. So like soul is a thing.
When we reincarnate, it's the soul that's entering a new body, and then that's just
it is the substitute. Yeah, but what you would say is
Jivatma.
That when you're reincarnating, the being is moving from one state of being to another state of being.
Anyway, we can argue semantics for a while. Let's just move on.
So, what I'm pointing out to you is that if you use the word soul, I think you're going to come up against a certain kind of resistance.
Well, I think the issue
because it has it's a very biblical term, and so I would avoid all the biblical terms personally. I would avoid falling into the field of the way they argue the biblical conceptions of God.
Because the word soul has conceptions which are generally attributed to it, which don't fit.
Yeah.
Would you like to mention something about those other ontologies of the soul, which is that worth going to? There's some odd ones.
Well, I mean, the general conception of the soul in this is always going to put you into a dualistic framework, and that there's lots of reasons why a dualistic framework is going to run into problems, and why in a dualistic framework you're gonna really rally against the idea of God. It becomes very cruel in a dualistic viewpoint, in my opinion. And I think that you could argue
because it's just a word we're using to.
It's not dualistic. No, it's not. This is the top. You haven't understood
as distinguished from the field.
Yeah, but the distinguishing factor between the soul and God becomes very different if you frame it in a dualistic point of view versus a non-dualistic point of view. The relationship between the soul and God is very, very different in the non-dualistic conception.
Does that refer to Vishnu Tattva?
Vishvatma is also Vishvatma is also the total Atma. It's like Sarvatma. So it's synonymous to Sarvadma. Yeah. The a lot of the whys change in a non-dual conception versus a dualistic conception. It's unique.
I've noticed when I've been doing all this apologetics and studying arguments offered against theology that some of the details of our theology start to make a lot more sense why they're stressed the way they are, because they answer philosophical paradoxes which would exist if we weren't precise about these particular details, like the
tapas or the ontologies are very significant, and arguably to enter into rasa without, or like the experiential, you could talk about personally experiential personalism without understanding deeply the ontology becomes problematic, and then you end up with just falling back into dualism, and then usually it turns into some kind of dogma. And well, I mean, there's dogma in all religious. There's always going to be dogma, but the negativities of we could have a whole conversation about the negativities of both in an imperfected state, but I would argue that God, or the concept of God, is far more defensible in a non-dual conception versus in a dualistic conception. And the perfect conception is one that is a paradox of duality and non-duality that happens simultaneously, and it's self-evident. Yes. So it says the Sarvatma is the original source of all senses, yet he is without the senses. He is unattached, although he is the maintainer of all living beings. He transcends the modes of nature, and at the same time, he is the master of the modes of nature, material modes of nature. Now, the supreme truth exists outside and inside of all living beings, in the moving and non-moving. Because he is subtle, he is beyond the power of the material sense to see or know. Although far, far away, he is also near to all. Although the Sarvatma appears to be divided among all beings, he is never divided. He is situated as one. Although he is the maintainer of every living entity, it is to be understood that he devours and develops all. He is the source of light in all luminous objects. He is beyond the darkness of matter and is unmanifested. He is knowledge. He is the object of knowledge, and he is the goal of knowledge. He is situated in everyone's heart. Thus, the field of activities, the body, knowledge, and knowable have been summarily described by me. Only my devotees can understand this thoroughly and thus attain my nature, my state of being, to enter into that total being. Material nature and the living entities should be understood to be beginningless. So here's a really interesting part. So what's going to happen is that a certain kind of thinker is going to come to this conclusion that material nature is beginningless, and that it's all functioning on determinism, that it has its own mechanics, and that those mechanics are controlling everything, and that everything is under the control of these mechanics. When you hear the description, when you hear someone like Sam Harris talk about it, like there's a really good conversation between Sam Harris and Joe Rogan. There's like a 15-minute clip that gives his perspective on that. And the conclusion that is come to is a conclusion that Krishna is about to describe. He says, nature is said to be the cause of all material causes and effects, whereas the living entity is the cause of various sufferings and enjoyments in this world. So, in your conversation with Tom Jump, did I remember that correctly? You get to the point where he's going, well, hang on a second. There's all these limiting factors that obviously are determining experience with the world. And Krishna is acknowledging this very fact here. He's acknowledging that the material phenomena, everything that's going on, including your mind and intellect, are all products of of material nature, and especially of your body. Your whole worldview is hinged on your body. And so Krishna is here just delving in it as the field as the body. And he is acknowledging that actually material nature is doing everything. But there's an interaction that's taking place between the material nature and the consciousness. And then the consciousness is something that's unique to that. And the interface is also a unique place, right? And that the way that the consciousness interacts with that experience and frames its perception of reality, and how it essentially really, later on you'll get to how it identifies, is going to determine how much or how little he's going to suffer the experience of moving through the deterministic portions of life. And that his own bias is going to subtly affect the determinism. And that it's going to have an impact. So what we're really going to get to is essentially the conversation. You go and you watch. There's a conversation between Faraz Zahabi and Joe Rogan that he argues. I think it's still titled something along the lines of scientific something discussing scientific method or something along those lines. And he describes in this conversation the best description of free will and determinism, and how that there are two train tracks that are parallel and that always manage to parallel each other. That you can see everything as free will and you can see everything as determinism, and how those two things are running side by side always. They don't converge, nor do they interfere with each other. And there's a uniqueness to this. So Krishna then goes, the living entity is material nature. The living entity in material nature thus follows the ways of life, enjoying the three modes of nature. Now, these three modes are referred to as gunas in Vedic theology. And these gunas are the qualities of the interaction between consciousness and matter. They're the three modes in which consciousness interacts with matter. They give a quality to the interaction. So they're typically called sattva or goodness, rajas or passion, and ignorance or tamas. And what you could, in a more simple way of defining it, is awareness, the motion in rajas, an emotion, in a creative motion with a goal in mind, and unawareness or ignorance.
And the Emma Paradigm lecture series he's putting out, he reckons he can describe the three modes of material nature and physics as there's two concepts in physics that are currently there, which is like creativity or movement towards complexity, which we only really find in life.
Yeah.
And entropy, which is a movement towards destruction or simplicity, things finding their simplest arrangements. But the third thing, which isn't currently there in physics, which life also does, stasis. So he reckons stasis.
Yes, stasis is a good. It's the place of coming to. It's coming to the awareness of being, and it's absorbing and taking on and having full awareness of being. The more full the awareness, the higher the state of sattva.
Chemistry and biology.
But what's being described here is that these three modes of nature are the interaction of the conscious perceiver and nature. So whether the role in physics is as important, although it must be, because there's still a consciousness somewhere in that, but it's for us to understand, this is what the mind is interacting with. There's an interaction there.
It makes sense for these three to have an echo in physics, because it's described that the three modes of material nature are how the material nature operates.
Well, because at the end of the day, everything is consciousness, and so that there would be an echo in physics would be. But what we're trying to show here is to make it. We're bringing it down to an individual in an individual body, the actual experience of the interaction between determinism and free will. So Krishna has put it into this. He's put into this conception in order to make it very individual, to take it within the framework of your, like there's nothing else outside of this. This is what there is. This is like Tom Jump said, the only self-evident truth that's undeniable is I think, therefore I am. So Krishna is taking this at this level. This is an experiential thing, and the gunas from an experiential bit are awareness, coming into awareness, moving towards a desired goal, and being ignorant of what's going on, or completely unaware. Like sleep is Krishna is going to say, One who understands this philosophy concerning material nature, the living entity, and the interaction of the modes of nature is sure to attain liberation. He will not take birth here again, regardless of the present position. Some perceive the supersoul or Sarvatma within themselves through meditation, others through the cultivation of knowledge, and still others through working without fruitive desires. Again, there are those who, although not conversant in spiritual knowledge, begin to worship the Supreme upon hearing about him from others. Because of their tendency to hear from authorities, they transcend the path of birth and death. O Chief of the Bhartas, know that whatever you see in existence, both moving and non-moving, is only a combination of the field of activities, Prakriti, and the knower of the field, consciousness. One who sees the Supreme Soul or the Supreme Being accompanying the individual being in all bodies, and who understands that neither the soul nor the super soul within the destructible body is ever destroyed, actually sees. So first he's setting up like, okay, you have to understand that there is this being, and that knowing this being is imperative in order for you to be able to deal with what's coming next. One who sees the super soul equally present everywhere in every living being does not degrade himself by his mind. Thus he approaches the transcendental destination. One who can see that all activities are performed by the body, Prakriti, which is created by material nature, and sees that the self does nothing, actually sees. When a sensible man ceases to see different identities due to different material bodies, and he sees how beings are expanded everywhere, he attains to Brahman conception. Those with the vision of eternity can see that the imperishable soul is transcendental, eternal, and beyond the modes of nature, despite contact with the material body. O Arjuna, the soul is neither does anything nor is entangled. The sky, due to its subtle nature, does not mix with anything, although it is all-pervading. Similarly, the soul, situated in Brahman, does not mix with the body, although situated in that body. O son of Bharata, as the sun alone illuminates all this universe, so does the living entity. One within the body illuminates the entire body by consciousness. So what he's describing is that actually the nature of that being is unembodied, is unencumbered, is not tied to any of this phenomenology. But what happens is when the being situated in the experience and then subjected to the experience, he identifies with the experience, and then he identifies as the doer of the experience, and he goes on through life. And he has some capacity to make choices. There is free will in this conception. But what
some people might interpret that as meaning there is no free will.
But what is being said is that there is no free will, and that there, in the sense that there is that it is deterministic. What he's describing is that Prakriti is deterministic. Is determinism, is functioning under determinism. And what he's going to describe is that that according to one's ability to become aware, is going to change the field of determinism. That the soul actually wagers his will on every time he pursues a desire. So what happens is the soul begins to, based on his interaction and identification with matter that's functioning on determinism, he starts to have he has a bias. And he has a bias to experiencing certain kinds of experiences, so he tries to direct his will. And he wagers his will against his freedom. In wagering his will against his freedom, now he becomes wrapped in what's called karma. He's set a ripple into time, and well, because by engaging that way, he is then subjected experientially to the limitations placed on him by material nature. So he's wagered his freedom against his will. Do you understand? Not against his will, like, oh, it was against his will. But I mean, like, if you make a bet, you go, okay, then I'm going to put this freedom on, I'm thinking this will. He's voluntarily accepted this position.
When you exert your will in a particular direction, you're closing doors. Is that kind of what you're saying? Like,
that's it.
I like the airplane analogy. Like,
yes.
I choose to get on an airplane. That's my free choice.
Once you're on it, you're on it.
I have some limited free choice. I can choose whether to eat or what to eat or whether to spend money.
Now, because the soul, the being is interacting with these gunas, he's more or less aware of which bit is fundamentally him and which bit is not him. And by identifying with that which is not him, it propels him into further and further knock-on consequences. We have this concept of karma, the action and reaction, or cause and effect. Essentially, karma is cause and effect that ripples through time, and that being experience doesn't just end at the culmination of one birth. That there's a constant evolution that's taking place even within one lifetime. You have to experience born as a baby and the limitations of a baby brain, and the limitations of a young person's experience, and the limitations of so like we have this word Maya. And Maya is sometimes referred to as illusion, but there's like several definitions of it that give it a much broader, and in Maya is this Prakriti that we're talking about. So one of the definitions of Maya is the limiter. It limits Brahman, the expanse, into this field of perception and it limits its sense of itself. It limits it and brings it into this concrete this field, this fixed identity. And you can see this essentially working functionally through the brain. The brain is a limiter. You're limited by your brain.
I laughed a few months ago and I called it, is consciousness produced by the brain or reduced by the brain?
Yeah. So what Krishna is going to point out is that a sane person actually begins to recognize the determinism. He recognizes actually, wait a second, how much am I actually willfully, what's going on here? He says, those who see with eyes of knowledge the difference between the body and the knower of the body can also understand the process of liberation. So they also start to be able to pull out.
Even for somebody who's not on a spiritual path, they still have some free will in that they're...
Of course, because everybody's so free will. So we're again, what is this will? What is the freedom? The freedom is to like something or not like something.
That's called the desire to vary our experiences.
That's it. So you have attraction, and Krishna says, the one who doesn't figure out that attraction and aversion are the same problem, and that to not sit in and try to experience. So the interesting part of the spiritual process is when the experiencer tries to experience the experiencer, not the external experience. Then something else takes place. When he starts to delve into and he starts to remove himself from, what's going on? So then Krishna, he then enters into these three modes of nature. Again, I shall declare to you this supreme wisdom, the best of all knowledge, knowing which all the sages have attained supreme satisfaction. By becoming fixed in this knowledge, one can attain to transcendental nature. So he's going to explain how as you become aware, your options also increase. And the less aware you are, the less options are, because the more you are being subjected to determinism, the more you're on the ride and you're not really aware of what's going on. The more aware you are of what's going on, the more options you have, the more you can go, the more you can resist the push of the universe pushing you in a certain direction. The more you are aware.
Found in small children or road rage. I think that if you had it on
or animals
where people start honking at each other, if you actually had an opportunity for them to sit down and have a conversation with each other about, what was going with the road, they wouldn't be yelling and angry, because as soon as you add concepts and language and ideas, then the anger becomes reduced. So, little children, they don't have many concepts and they can't communicate. So there's just frustration and greed and so on. Whereas when we start to learn concepts, and a lot of psychology, they train people to write down, like Jordan Peterson has a self-authoring program, which has had a lot of good results, where you actually write down how you're feeling and your ideas and your goals, and this ability to put your thoughts and feelings into words, it makes it more concrete. And so basically you're getting more self-knowledge, which gives you more freedom.
Yeah. And ultimately Krishna is going to point out that these gunas are all within the sphere of material reality, and that even the sattva, or the awareness of reality as we seem to perceive it, is ultimately, you'll see that he acknowledges there's a limitation even to that, and that the one who recognizes this, he acts in a certain kind of way. And what Krishna uniquely points out here is it's a very non-sectarian thing. This is not a fundamentalist religious kind of idea. So anybody can access this kind of awareness, whether you call yourself an atheist, a Buddhist, or this ism or that ism, that it's a natural process of self-awareness, becoming aware. So, if you have a listen to Sam Harris discuss why he became a vegan, this is not someone who is acting from a place of unawareness. This is someone who's thinking about why he does what he does and why, right? And Krishna, he's going to point out the quality of someone who's acting this way, but not only acting this way, but comes to the point of understanding that even these gunas are part of this, are part of the whole interaction, and that one who becomes situated, who's trying to become more and more self-situated or situated in being and not in phenomenology, he can pull back, and that he has certain qualities. He says, O son of Pandu, he who does not hate illumination or enlightenment, attachment and delusion when they are present, or long for them when they disappear, who is unwavering and undisturbed through all these reactions of the material qualities, remaining neutral and transcendental, knowing that the modes alone are active, who is situated in the self and regards alike happiness and distress, who looks upon a lump of earth, a stone, a piece of gold with an equal eye, who is equal towards the desirable and the undesirable, who is steady, situated equally well in praise and blame, honor and dishonor, who treats alike both friends and enemy, and who has renounced all material activities. Such a person is said to have transcended the modes of nature. So the material experience is largely deterministic, and the will is very subtle. So everything that's the phenomenology essentially is determinism.
It might help to give an example, like a puppy dog. One example people use is, you can train a puppy dog. You put food in front of it, and you can train it in such a way that it's like you leave it like they do one with puppies. It's like, if you can eat that, I'm going to go away and leave that marshmallow in front of you. And if you don't eat it by the time I come back, I'll give you two. We're making something like that with dogs. And and you can train dogs to the point where they'll actually constrain their desire to eat it until their owner comes back.
So the way I so you have a set of the choices of like and dislike, or the biases, these biases, they are dictated by consciousness, by the being,
so
the conscious being.
Biases, we mean hankerings and aversions.
Well, yeah, biases. You're biased in this way or that way. So bias can go, you're like, I don't want to deal with that, and I want that. I don't want that, I want that. This is a bias. And it's produced of dualistic thinking, because you haven't quite recognized the reality of the situation.
And those biases, there's a layer of it which is just the mechanical structure of the brain, but there's also a layer of it which is the desiring of the soul.
So the biases that are with the mechanical structure of the brain, so there you have limitations that are, you could say, karmic. So the description is that the bodies are produced based on karma, and the gunas that are acquired by the individual within his existence is in that frame of time. He's creating the circumstances by which he's going to then have to continue to experience.
Sure. Just like we talk about the crystal ball. It's clear, you put it down on a green surface and it's green, you put it down on a yellow surface and it's yellow, so the soul enters into a particular body with a particular type of body and then identifies with that body. So because what Krishna has pointed out in this is that there's a distinction between consciousness and material, he's the conscious perceiver, I should say it in that is more clear, because they're going to get a point to where Krishna is going to say that it is all consciousness and that the womb, which is Prakriti, and the Purusha are both, you could say, consciousness. And so it gets more complicated in that sense. But the conscious perceiver, there's a distinguishment between the conscious perceiver, Purusha, and the conscious experience, Prakriti. And so karma arises from
self-identification. So as you're identifying with matter, you become invested in the sense of being attached to the results of matter, and you pursue the results of matter through time. And the jiva, the conscious being, has more or less awareness, self-awareness. And so he is more or less capable of understanding what's actually happening, and therefore interacting with his own identity, how he's perceiving the world through identity. So the way they describe creation is very interesting, because it starts with ego, then mind, then intellect, then matter. And we see this phenomenally, experientially, in that your experience of the world is very much painted by how you view yourself and how you frame the story of yourself, and then how that story interacts with the world. Everything is painted with that lens.
Have you heard
and then how you
cybernetics? Psychocybernetics
no.
was a psychological therapy methodology which was developed by a plastic surgeon. And I think that there's very interesting philosophical implications of his work. So he started out by asking the question, based on an observation he'd had, that some of his patients, after having a slight cosmetic defect removed, would have their entire lives dramatically transformed. And it's like, well, why would just having like a mole or whatever it is have such a dramatic impact on somebody's life? And then other people would have a cosmetic defect removed and have no change at all. So he began investigating this, and the answer he came up with was a sense of identity. That when you identify as ugly and worthless, then
that impacts your world experience.
And
and you project it. You project it into the world, and it frames the way you think about and feel about the world. And then your perception of the world is entirely changed, and your desires.
If you think you're the body, then you're going to have all these desires based on the body. Whereas if you think you're spirit
based on the body,
well, you have desires based on the identity as the spirit soul. So
your self-interest changes. When your self-interest changes, how you interact with reality changes.
Yeah. His explanation of why he thinks it is that our mind has a certain picture of ourselves and the world, and it's constantly trying to make our experience consistent with that. So if I think I'm terrible at math, then when I go and sit a math exam, my mind's going to be sabotaging my math performance in order to make reality consistent with that identity. And so they had a lot of success, and like with the math example, teaching people it's not that you're bad at math, it's just that you haven't performed well at math in the past. So I knew about this before I came to Krishna consciousness. I'd heard the audio version of his work. And then when I started reading Bhagavad Gita, I thought, oh, this is like totally in line with this psychological phenomenon. And the Prabhupada would say, first, you have to understand you're not this body. If you can't understand you're not this body, you can't get anywhere. And that made complete sense based on psychocybernetics.
And that's essentially what Krishna is saying here, that if you don't come to a place of understanding that you're more than this body, I won't use the word, I wouldn't even describe it as not this body, because there's going to come a point philosophically where you're going to accept that body is also part of yourself.
Well, we're
that
getting
you're
semantics here, and we came into that earlier. That when we say the soul doesn't, the things are carried out by the material nature, not by the soul. It's like, well, yes and no.
No, but
because
we
desire I desire to live
everything that's happening. Desire, yes, but sure. But what's being described by Krishna is that even you can say you had the desire, but that desire in itself is not the causal agent. I mean, it is and it isn't.
An element of a causal agent it's on the Jivatma's desiring to vary its experience.
Okay, so causal agent is not but it's still not the doer.
No, well,
you can be the cause and not the doer. In the same way that, say, if we had,
it goes on in a factory. So when you push that button, you're not the doer, but you still played a causal role.
Sure. So what's being painted is this picture of free will and determinism running side by side, and how the determinism limits. So the karma is the functional determinism. Basically, karma is functional determinism. It's fate, and it's fatalistic to a point, because what happens is that your karma is limiting how many possibilities that it is possible to actually experience and respond to with will. Sometimes you have next to no option to, like no amount of will is going to get you past a certain moment. That's it. And sometimes you'll have some more, and sometimes you'll have more than that. So even
of the senses, or the material mind, like the brain, are so strong that the willpower is just swept away with it.
Well, there's that, but there's also just life experience. So, for example, like you could have willed death not to come, but it's not going to affect the fact that death will one day come.
Yeah. So I think what's worth mentioning is one aspect of karma.
Or like you can have you living in the world, right? And you have your will, but the reality is you as part of your world is only a small part of your world. There's so many people in your world that you have no control of. You have no control of those people or how they think, and yet they're part of the field of your experience. They're part of your karma. So when it's described, when the free will is described, it's described that you have very minute amount of will relative to how much stuff you don't have a will to impose on. How much is imposed on you versus how much you're able to impose your will is very uneven. And so Krishna comes to a point, and he comes to a point that's the same point that Sam Harris comes to in his conversation with Joe Rogan, that actually when you understand determinism, it brings you to a place of great compassion. Great understanding that people are actually not as in control of things as we might project onto them. They're not as that the circumstances are such that it puts a certain kind of pressure on them, and therefore they're going through life in a certain kind of way. And therefore there's a compassion that comes from that. And Krishna also, he expresses this. And so where I think the conversation of free will and determinism should go when dealing with it is an acknowledgement of determinism, and still an acknowledge it's like chincha beta beta tuppa. This paradox is happening, that there is both determinism and will, and that sometimes, depending on how conscious and aware you are, you have more or less freedom within that determinism. The more aware you are, the more freedom you have to impact the determinism, or to extricate yourself from the deterministic outcomes. You can extricate yourself from cause and effect. Even the concepts of like, you could get into, like, someone in the comments section brought up hell and different kinds of, Krishna's a pretty awful person if you're subject to his will, and yet you then have to go and experience all these horrible things against your will. And so all of this is a result of how you identify and get on this train of cause and effect, and that the process of self-realization, as described by the yogis of India in particular, or the transcendentalists, however you want to describe them, the meditators, is that the process of awakening to the self nature, or even more than that, you could say to the nature and experience of being. Even the word self is got all kinds of, that's a quagmire. That experience opens up the possibilities. It opens up it opens up freedom, and it opens up the. Is it a bit patchy?
But it's gone all pixelated.
Sorry about that. I'm not sure what's going on. And so ultimately, the will is to broaden your sense of self, or to reduce it through awareness or ignorance, willfully. Sometimes you don't realize you're willfully moving into the realm of ignorance, and especially when you're passionately pursuing whatever it is you want. And that consciousness itself is the key to, that exploring consciousness is the key to the whole thing. Understanding free will, determinism, the relationship of those. Krishna describes that is actually knowledge.
Right. I mean, one thing I was thinking of when you were making that point about free will and determinism both playing a role is something that comes up in many other discussion subjects. So it's a common thing these days, especially in politics and sociological views, to try to have black and white attitudes, either the left is right or the right is right, or
that's it.
This thing is all good or it's all bad. It's like almost nothing is black and white.
No, it's more, that's right. So I think that the broadest possible view is understanding that it is deterministic, and there's also an interplay between determinism and free will, and that free will has a unique part of very doing little shifts in direction, which then can have great knock-on effects, consequences, and that identity in itself is a limiting factor. How you identify is an actual, you're like constructing the framework of what you call yourself. And you're limiting yourself within the framework of what you've defined, how you've defined yourself.
Well, when we identify closely as the body, then we're very caught up in the sufferings and enjoyments of the body.
Enjoyments of the body and the various phenomenology that's going on there. And the more that you can identify with universal principles, our universal existence, even, you could say, that the broader your sense of self is, the more capable you are of experiencing the ups and downs of life in such a way that doesn't cause you to cause others harm. That should be the result for someone who successfully has integrated their sense of self.
Might be an external symptom we could use to verify if somebody's made progress.
Yes, that would be a good definition or a good barometer, and it's something that is, again, what I would point out to is non-sectarian. It's not possessed by any religious group or any ism.
Maybe we should touch on some of his objections. So one of the things I was trying to get at, maybe I didn't do a very good job in my exchange with Tom Jump, was that because he was asking, like, well, how is that any different from the compatibilistic view of free will, where it's all determined by physical processes ultimately? And I think the real issue with that compatibilism is that consciousness cannot be explained based on a physical process. So when we have this, we know we're having conscious experiences and desiring to vary our experiences accordingly.
Yeah, so it goes again with identity. So the more you identify, so even like when most people talk about consciousness, oftentimes they're actually talking about the mind. And it's interesting that in most Eastern philosophies, there's some distinction between the mind and the perceiver of the mind, and that the perceiver of the mind is more fundamental, right? And that there's a lot of meditative practices that are aimed at situating yourself so deeply in that then the mind, the screen of the mind becomes observable, not as something that is like you've invested yourself into your thoughts, but you've actually stepped back from your thoughts and you're witnessing your thoughts happen. And in witnessing, you actually experience, oh, there's my mind, and then there's something more fundamental that is witnessing this.
The material mind and the spiritual mind, because even in the spiritual
and the chitta
world, they're still thinking, feeling, and willing.
Yes, but the would be a whole nother conversation. But essentially, in because it's something that what happens in the spiritual process and practically is first there's this removing yourself. There's this like removing all the things that you're not and getting to the place, even like what Sam Harris would describe as no self.
Oh yeah, but that's a temporary state, right?
Well, yes and no. So yes, in the sense that there's also from that is an experience of a self that is transcendent to a body or any kind of material time and space. And there is also that framework of what Sam Harris would call no self.
But that's like the
that's always part of self nature.
So
yes,
you can go there, but you can't go there for eternity because you get bored. And the bodhisattvas that have attained the eternal Brahmajyoti, they get bored and come back down and end up doing philanthropy, and later they might take a bhakti and go to the spiritual world.
Bored is one way to put it. I would say that there's a natural there's an original rising of phenomenon,
state of oneness,
and so that to be able to go deeper into the internal phenomenon requires a certain kind of attachment. You have to have a will to do that. If you don't have a desire to experience that, you won't. And if you develop a certain kind of framework in which your goal is the you could say no self nothingness experience, then from that experience again arises phenomenology. And if you see that and go, well, I guess I'll try that again, you have that will. You can fall back into that. But I don't have a direct experience of that exactly. So
he says that the natural state of the soul is activity and service. So this impersonal Brahmajyoti destination cannot be permanent because it doesn't suit the eternal nature of the soul.
So the soul becomes self-aware. The thing that happens is the soul becomes self-aware. The self-awareness of the jiva can go both ways. So that's an interesting topic of discussion. Where was I just before we went there?
How a deterministic world doesn't have consciousness. So if they think that their compatibilism is a solution, they need to...
Well, the deterministic world doesn't... Well, Krishna's not saying the deterministic world doesn't have...
About nothing's black and white. So if you want if they want to say everything is a product of physical chemicals, and there's it's basically a version of monism. They're saying there's nothing but physical matter.
Yes.
It functions all times according to physical laws, and everything we experience is just a product of chemicals smashing together. There's no way you can get consciousness out of physical matter. So, yeah.
Well, I would say that, the burden of proof is they tend to say the burden of proof is on the theist to prove the existence of God, but it always strikes me as interesting because the burden of proof seems to be in their court because we have no example ever of life or consciousness being produced of matter, and yet that is the faith. That is the faith leap that they take. Yeah. They have a leap of faith. They take a leap of faith. And they arise at it in the same way that the theists do. The theist and the atheist, they both look at the world as the proof. They say, well, here it is, and it's happening, and there's no God. Show me God. And yet there's consciousness. That's the proof that from matter comes consciousness.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like circular reasoning. It's like in logic, you can go two ways. You can put together your logic and arrive at a conclusion, and you can say, well, this conclusion isn't true. Or you can say, I know that conclusion's not true, therefore there's something wrong with my logic. You can go out. Yeah, so the philosophers do this. If they come up with an argument, it can prove a square triangle, then they go, okay, something's wrong with our logic. Let's go back and figure out what we did wrong. So they're basically doing that. They say, well, logic tells us that consciousness can't come from matter, but we already know that consciousness comes from matter, so it must.
Yes. The thing that's unique and different between the dualistic versus the non-dualistic perception of the relationship of God in the world is in the dualistic perception, God is something separate and away from the world. It's like someone somewhere, and that somehow he created the world and it's something else. And that there's this, even devotees have this idea of like, oh, there's the spiritual world and then there's the material world. And there's two different. Well, the element of that is perception.
Give me 1 second. I'll be right back.
Okay. Where were we? Spiritual world, material world. So spiritual world and material world is a perception only. It's an internal reality. It's present. It's ever present everywhere, really. But there's a perception. So the limited soul is perceiving the world as material. And that is the illusion.
All spiritual.
The illusion is that
it's just
it's all self. It's all self nature. So the Maya, the illusion of that which is not. When we look at that word not defined that way, the not is that the external world is separate from me.
But there is still a distinction, like
that this
material world, everything decomposes. It's a place of death. Desiring material.
Right, but these are all perceptions. This is the appearance. So what's being described is the appearance. It appears this way. It appears and as long as everyone's that's the appearance. But there's another state you can experience where you see the same of what's going on a different level. So yes, on one level of truth, we could say there's a material world and a spiritual world. You can do that duality, and this is the world of duality. When you're functioning in the world of duality, then you have this whole material phenomenon. The higher than that is a completely non-dual, and the experience of that complete non-dual is an ocean of white light. Then there's an experience even higher than that, or a truth that's more encompassing is that then also has a phenomenology that also has qualities and you could say a certain kind of appearance.
The epistemology I was presenting in my discussion with Tom Jump of self-evident proof that you have a dream and then you wake up from your dream and you just know based on the quality of your experience that this waking life is more real than my dream. And then you take to a spiritual path and get realized knowledge about a spiritual reality. And you realize this is more real than my materialistic consciousness. And people who have near-death experiences, they describe that their consciousness, when they're out-of-body experience, like they meet with relatives or whatever kind of out-of-body experience, they think faster. There's colors that aren't there. There's sounds that we don't have in this material world. And overall, they describe that their experience of reality and that out-of-body state is more real than this material reality we're experiencing now.
Like one of the most profound, my brother and I, all my family, we had a similar profound moment that changed the way I considered reality as I saw it before. So at a certain point in time, we all kind of became interested in astral projection. I don't remember how or who, but all of us at a certain point in time became interested in this idea, and we all tried it with different experiences. So for myself, the process of astral projection or astral travel or whatever you want to call it that I learned is a process of like yoga nidra, where you relax, the body goes into a you're doing a certain kind of meditation, and you go into an ultra relaxed state where you basically want your body to functionally like go into sleep, but you want to remain awake. And you get to this bit, then all of a sudden stuff happens. And it's very difficult. I found it very, very troublesome. And ultimately, because of that, I eventually abandoned it. But when it worked at its best, what would happen to me, it would feel like having, like if you were hooked onto a cord at your back, right? Be in bed, and then, well, you'd have a few phenomena. Like you have this feeling of like coming out of you're rising up out of your body and then like moving and then resting back in. And then there's all kinds of sounds that are involved. You hear like what are described as the nadis. You'll hear like intense ringing. It'll go like kind of intense, and you'll feel a buzzing through your body. And then you'll have this feeling of like you come up and you come out and then back in for a second. And then it feels like you're connected by a rope that like pulls you, almost feels like you've been pulled. For me, it was always from the back up and out. And then when you're out, there's like, it feels like wind that blows you around. You feel like I always describe it like for anybody who's seen the movie American Beauty, and there's the footage of the plastic bag kind of being blown around in the wind. It feels like that. You're being blown around in this pranic wind. And nothing works quite the same way. Like if you try to move the way you normally move, you'll end up moving your body and waking up. It's very frustrating to try to learn the new mechanics of how to work in that space. You've worked so hard to get out, and then you do something stupid and you wake yourself up. Like you come to I mean, you were awake the whole time, but like you go back. So anyway, I always had the problem of I could get to the point where I could control movement and I could situate myself. I could write myself. I could get it, but I could never see. I always wanted to see. The practice that you're supposed to do, because it's a spiritual practice, is you're supposed to come out of your body and you're supposed to look at and observe your body. But I could never figure out how to actually open those eyes. And the last time I did most successfully, what happened is I came out of my physical body. I dealt with the floating around and righted myself. And then I was trying to see. And at a certain point, it was like a screen went like doof, and opened up. And I looked at the screen. I was like, huh? And I then entered into that screen, and I literally stepped, like it was like a step down, and I stepped into a dream world. But when I did, it was like, I'm sure everyone has experienced becoming kind of aware while you're dreaming, having some version of a lucid dream. But this was next level from that. I stepped into this dream world, and it was as real as anything I've ever experienced here. The way it felt, like I started walking through, and it was very confusing. It's very disconcerting. It was like, huh, it's a very, very bizarre experience. And when you go in, you touch down, and it is not different than this experience. And I'm in this house, and I'm walking through the house, and I'm totally confused. And, I'm like touching everything, and I'm like, what the actual fuck? And then in this dream space, my wife walks by, and I'm getting more and more confused. And then I put my hand on her, and she reacts, and I react. And as I react, I then am back in my body, in my normal existence as I have known it. But the experience was so the same when I entered into that dream space that it definitely made me look at my perception of this as real in a different way.
So the skeptics would just say, oh, that's all just your brain playing tricks on you. You never left your body, and it was just neurons firing in your brain producing that experience.
Well, they can say whatever they like, and it could even be that there are brain firing in a certain way which allowed my consciousness to experience itself in a different kind of way. in a different kind of, maybe there's certain kind of limitations that are removed. Like if you look at out-of-body experiences and the research on out-of-body experiences, they definitely connected certain parts of the brain. If they're stimulated, you have some kind of an out-of-body experience. Now, if the brain is producing consciousness, then we would have to buy that conclusion. But if the consciousness is something that's more fundamental or unique and that is interplaying with the brain, then we would be able to explain that in a slightly different way. And that we would be able to accept that you will have brain phenomenology that's going to accompany whatever conscious experience you are, because there's an interface between the brain and consciousness. Now, the main point I make is that experientially still, there was something very unique about that experience that made me question the nature of reality as we perceive it or call it real. And that experience, that's kind of stuck with me, and it propelled me. So the thing that was unique is that, so I always experienced, I couldn't see. I didn't figure out how to open my eyes. My mother, she blasted out of her body and she went up into the neighbor's apartment. She was in the neighbor's apartment and she witnessed his house having never been in it. Then later on, being invited to the neighbor's house, she knew exactly where the bathroom was, having never been in his house, but having been to his house in her astral body. So for me, that's enough proof. That's enough confirmation. So like, there's a lady who does TED Talks. She did a TED Talk and she's specifically talking about astral projection or astral travel or whatever you want to, out-of-body experiences, and how there's a greater need for scientific study of this phenomenon, because when she was a child, she experienced an out-of-body experience where she left her body and went to another part of the country and witnessed her uncle on an operation table having a certain kind of procedure done to him. And she watched the whole thing, then enters back, and then she asked her mother about her uncle. And no one actually in the family knew that he was sick and that he was having this operation. And she described exactly what was happening. So for her, that was proof that there's something more than this idea that, no, that this is just like a brain thing. It's like, no. So, I think that if you've had the experience, you would question the validity that it's just some other
a lot of cases like that
phenomenon.
Like people who have out of body experiences or near death experiences. There's a distinction between the two. I can't remember what it is, where they see family members that have departed. They never see a family member which hasn't departed ever, but family members who've departed that they had no awareness of them having departed. So they might see an uncle that had died 2 days ago, and they didn't know that the uncle had died 2 days ago. So you can't explain this consistency of only seeing people who've departed based on the person's foreknowledge.
Right. Going back for a second to the determinism free will thing, I think that the bit that I think they have a hard time with is because they feel that there wasn't a choice to the circumstances of your life.
Well, that's like the airplane thing. You chose to be on this airplane before you entered this lifetime.
Yeah. So if there isn't an acceptance of the transmigration of being, then there's a harder time accepting this aspect of free will. But even still, I think that there must be some way to prove an element of choice. But I don't know how to do that.
That it's all caused by the brain, because they're never going to be able to map out. So Tom Jump was asking me, well, they can, do an MRI of somebody's, like monkey's brains or something, and they can predict what they're going to do for the next 15 minutes. It's like, well, I can know. I was telling Tom Jump I could know my son so well that I know what he's going to do for the next 15 minutes too. So it's just a more sophisticated version of that, but it's not deterministic, and there's, the element of the soul choosing to vary its experience. So it's developed a particular mentality, and it may act predictably as long as it's got that mentality, but the soul may choose to vary its experiences away from that and develop a new mentality, and that's not something we can predict. Some example that genetically there's genes that if somebody has, they're more likely to react negatively to trauma and themselves become an abuser. But I think, again, this can go back to the airplane example that, like there's that verse, which is, I don't know what the Sanskrit is for it, but it's often chanted by Hare Krishna kids in schools, that if Krishna wants to save you, nobody can harm you, and if Krishna wants to kill you, nobody
can save you. Mare Krishna Rake Krishna Mare Ke.
That and so with free will, if there's something we've got coming to us as our karma, like Tom Jump was giving all these examples of neurological conditions and tumors growing in the brain and stuff. It's like that's not normal stuff.
Well, I think that the response that I would have given to that is that the overarching consistent means or methodology, or you could say principles that are applying here is that your physical experience is within the framework of karma, and everything that's going on in that physical experience is then with the framework of karma. And to the degree that you're free, or to the degree that you're not free, is to the degree that you are, in a sense, as responsible as you identify with all that or not. You understand what I mean? What I mean by that is the soul, the karmic cycle is based on the soul identifying as the doer. Then he becomes subject to karma. He lays claim to the fruits of action.
This is starting to sound like common law stuff. I don't know if you've heard about that empowerment solution stuff, where if the legal system that's set up in Commonwealth countries actually has a God conscious element to it, and all the statutes are laid down on top of that. So all the acts and whatnot, you actually have to acquiesce to them.
Right.
If you say I'm like they say your birth certificate identifies you as a corporation, and if you accept that identity as a corporation, and then you fall within their legal structure and you accept their dictates, and that when they pass laws, they have something called if you don't speak when you could have spoken, then it's considered to be assent.
Right.
So, but if you identify as a man or woman, as stay in the private realm and don't enter into the corporate realm, then their laws don't apply to you, and it's just Commonwealth laws, which are, I think that's what they call it, which are all based on agreement.
Right.
So you can't harm another person; that's criminal. But in terms of that, like if you're just traveling, like speeding fines and so many other things that you wouldn't apply to you if you. So a similar thing you're saying about.
So if we use the plane example.
Yeah.
Let's use the plane example. So when you take a flight, you have legs of a trip, right? You have your starting point, and then you have various legs of the trip. And once you're on the trip, you're on the plane till it gets to the next destination. There's no backing out at that point. But you could get to a leg of the thing, and you could change your mind. You could have you know what? Actually, I'm not going to get on the next leg.
Yeah.
So the process of birth and death is kind of like this, and the process of karma. So the soul identifying with the body, he moves through this leg of the trip. He considers himself to be the doer, and he then develops attraction and aversion to the fruits of action, of activity. Then at each death, there's actually an opportunity to acknowledge that actually I wasn't really the doer, and to identify properly with the whole and direct his will to experiencing the whole rather than the subjective tiny portion, and being not attached to the fruits of what he thought he deserved or didn't deserve on the previous leg. That by being attached to his previous existence, he becomes attached to the things of that and wants to pursue the should have, would have, could have. I should have done this. I could have done that. Oh, if only this, if only that. These propel him into his next experience, his next birth, his next embodied experience, to pursue those experiences. He has the desire to experience the embodied experience in a certain kind of way, and that propels him. And because he's then again bound by the karmic echoes into time. And the purpose of these echoes are ultimately to cause an evolution within his conscious experience of self-awakening. So it's actually supposed to bring him to a point of self-awareness. And he has the option, even actually on the flight, to be honest. It doesn't have to happen at death. On the flight, he can acknowledge, oh, wait a second.
You don't do it on the flight. It's pretty hard to do it at the moment of death.
At the time of death. But that opportunity is always there. You know, you see the descriptions, especially if you go to Buddhism, where they describe the bardo, the experience of death. And the bardo is this in between, and the experience of having your feelings and it's like a experiences brought back to you, and you're going to have to digest those experiences. You're going to manifest in certain kinds of phenomena, and then your attraction or aversion is going to direct you or push you away. It becomes like a test. This is sort of described in Garuda Purana as well. That this bardo state happens to people. So you have in Garuda Purana the description of the transmigration of the soul. It's like those beings who are grossly ignorant, who functioned in the world of gross ignorance. They have a certain kind of experience. Then those beings who have a very aware life and then a very aware death, they have another kind of experience after death. And then there's a third kind of where it's a middle ground. Then then death becomes a particular kind of testing ground to see which way are you actually leaning. So I really like watching descriptions of people's near-death experiences for this reason. Very fascinating. Their bardo experiences, their in-between experiences, the way they perceive God, the way they perceive themselves. I find it tremendously interesting, and often substantially validates a lot of our own philosophy in terms of, like, not necessarily in form, but certainly in function.
Say, Christians, when they have near-death experiences or out-of-body experiences, they have Christian symbology and whatnot, and Muslims, like, they'll see the color green, which is a color to the gram, and Hindus will have different. So how does that prove any particular ontology?
Well, the thing is, like, if you are attached, so again, it comes into this dualistic kind of framework where in a dualistic conception, you're going to say, well, okay, Thor is different from Zeus, is different from Odin, is different from Krishna, is different from, you can have this kind of thing. Where in a non-dualistic conception, you can see, well, okay, well, God could conceivably appear to anyone as they are accustomed to him appearing to them, or he can do it however he likes. So if they are accustomed to worshiping God as a burning bush, he could appear to them as a burning bush, and at the same time, it might not be that way. I think there's plenty of people that are very surprised by the experience that they have, and it's not anything like what they were expecting.
Jesus and then becoming Christians. They likely weren't planning to become Christians ever.
Yeah, or there's a very interesting one on YouTube of this atheist guy who had a darshan of the Virgin Mary. He had a visionary experience of the Virgin Mary, and then it completely changed his life. And his description of her is very much the way we would describe Tara. And I found that very interesting. And so, like, we have these ideas of, like, tattvas, Shakti tattvas. Okay, this is goddess tattva, and how it can manifest in various ways, and that each manifestation is part of the Shakti tattva, or the divine feminine, and yet can also be distinct individually.
Just Googling.
Tara. So Tara is a form of goddess Parvati. And she's specifically when she's the consort of Akshobhya or Shiva as Guru. She's Guru Shakti, Tara. She is the bridge by which knowledge is transmitted. So she becomes the matrikas, the sounds themselves.
It's also a word in Malachi.
And she's kind of like Saraswati, a similar tattva. But they're coming through the Maya Devi in that spectrum of the Mahavidyas, Tara. But it's this compassion and he described her, like the sound of her voice being like the totality of all music and knowledge. It was like, it's a profound thought. And Tara is like that. So anyway, I don't have it personally, like this argument that, you only believe in some of the gods. And I'm like, nah, I don't have an issue there. I can take it all. Now, I don't necessarily have the hierarchy of how I see them in the importance or whatever. Like when I was younger, I had a certain kind of experience, and I saw an Anubis. Now, I have no interest. I've never had any interest in Egyptian theology necessarily, I think the Egyptian culture is kind of cool, but I never really got really deep into Egyptian stuff. And yet, in this meditative experience, I witnessed an Anubis, a being in front of me with that hound head. He didn't have any kind of like armature but it was a being that was recognizably Anubis as soon as I saw it. I was like, holy smoke. Yeah, no problem. So I think that God is something that's very unlimited. It is, and the more unlimited you make it, him, her, the more possibility it becomes very easy to understand that he will and can present himself however he or she likes, according to the individual.
To that objection, and just say it makes sense that an all-loving, all-powerful God would present himself and reciprocate with people in a way that is well received by them, familiar with them, and so on.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, yeah, it doesn't bother me at all.
And the imagery and tone of voice and all that's going to make the person you're interacting with feel
well, because the symbology and the imagery might have that symbology. See, the other thing is that symbology and imagery is it holds a certain kind of truth. Like they wouldn't call it truth. We're gonna have like a Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson whole like debate about that. But essentially what Jordan Peterson's describing is what I'm saying, that those symbols, they hold something, and they might hold something particularly dear to that person and particularly meaningful to that person that impacts that person in a very meaningful way.
Analogy here too, that, like when it comes to theology, like one reason why we can argue our theology is superior is because our theology has the most explanatory power. So, like the elephant analogy where the blind men are holding different parts of the elephant's body and arguing about it. Whereas if somebody comes along with a conception of an elephant, they can end the argument and say, no, you're all right. It's an elephant. It has a tail. It has a leg. It has ears. It's got a trunk. It's got a belly.
Anyhow, thank you very much for having me on your thing. Hopefully it wasn't too rambly.
I think objections I think we should reply to. So
sure.
An objection that came up in the comments was, we're just saying that people choose to be born sick or choose to have a brain tumor if we're arguing for free will being a causal factor.
Well, if you are on one level, we would say, yes, that's true. And another level, we would say that it has entered into the realm of consequences. So oftentimes, even in this life, it's self-evident that we made a choice that has consequences that deeply impact our experience, that it could include The choices of what we ate for 50 years gave us a brain tumor.
Son, like you got to have consequences with children. Like that, you need to. They need a dose of reality to grow up, right? So it's like if you do that. So it's like
I think that the interesting thing is that if you think of these experiences in the spectrum of good and bad, then you're going to have a certain perception of them. If you think of these experiences as experiences without the labels of good and bad, then you'll see that each of these experiences are a unique experience that bring about a certain kind of internal change. And that life isn't like, again, the Abrahamic conception of God is this like quite authoritarian, sort of menacing dude oftentimes. And this is what I would consider like the way you would talk to children in a sense, when you're like, it's sort of simplistic. But if you look at the material reality as a grounds for people coming to a certain state of awareness or being, then certain negative experiences are conducive to certain kinds of realizations, certain kinds of appreciation, certain kinds of, they change you fundamentally. And oftentimes you'll see that people have the most self-development in times of great adversity. The great adversity challenges them to
right. Well, now we're touching on
develop.
The problem of evil.
And so,
really.
Well, exactly. So the problem of evil, if you go to the problem of evil, the way that's explained within Vedic theology is that essentially, so we have this will, we have this small soul who has a will and who has a desire. Then we have material nature, and then we have this I'm going to go as quickly as possible. You have a super soul who's aware on every level, and he's also fundamentally going, okay, well, you want to pursue that desire. I'm going to give you the opportunity to pursue that desire, and I'm going to facilitate it. So Krishna is a facilitator. Ishvara is a facilitator. You want to pursue that? You're free to do that. You're free to pursue that because I'm free and you're part of me. And so go ahead, pursue that. And when everybody pursues their selfish desires, what you get is on some level inevitably evil.
Yeah, right.
And it is you could say a necessary evil if you're going to let everybody freely pursue their own interest. Because somebody is going to misuse that interest in a way that will cause harm to others. In a perfect system, it all balances out to make sure that those people who cause harm to others experience an experience in which they will then have a change and will not pursue causing harm to others. That the experience of causing harm to others has consequences naturally occurring that will ultimately bring about a change of heart, and it's self-correcting. So that's how the cause of evil is addressed.
Like explaining the reasons or purpose behind why smoking cigarettes might give cancer. Because I would give an analogy that, if someone smokes cigarettes and get cancer, did they choose to get cancer, or did they simply take a course of action where cancer was one of the consequences? Or like
exactly.
Son,
they chose
it. Like we give them a consequence, like, if you yell at us or if you hurt your baby brother, then we're going to take your favorite toy away for the rest of the day. And he's like, but I don't want my toy taken away. It's like, okay, well then
don't do that.
And we won't take your toy away. But I don't want you to take the toy away.
Like a unique part of, in Sanskrit, when you look at the words for sin and, especially the word for sin, you have this word pop. And the most literal meaning of pop is that which takes away your freedom. So you can see it's self-evident. So you take something, okay, we say, oh, it's sinful. Like, for example, alcohol would be considered sinful. Well, you see that if you indulge in alcohol, that it sends you down a life path that ultimately, in so many ways, limits your freedom.
I was the second objection you kind of touched on with explaining the reason why there's suffering. So thanks for tuning in. This is my first interview with a fellow Hare Krishna where we go into details of the theology. So if you want to hear more, give us a like and some comments down below. We'll put the links in the description to the videos which Nimai spoke of. Thanks for tuning in. Hare Krishna.